Oi, oi, it's your boy, Jack Slack. And I'm not in a great mood, if I'm honest. Just, what the fuck was that? That was the strangest night of fights since the last night of fights. We're on just a bizarre run. And it gets even weirder because the same thing that caused the Peter Yan stopped a fight last night or Saturday night. Um, today's episode, obviously not an awful lot we can talk about technically from like the marquee fights. I mean, we'll talk about some of the stuff from the lesser fights, but I suppose we better jump in with just the main event. What the fuck? It's just, naffs me off, probably naffs Leon Edwards off, probably naffs Belal Muhammad off. It's just one of those ones that is just a big shit sandwich. There's not really any upside to it. I mean, in the aftermath, of course, Leon Edwards says that he still thinks he's worth a title shot, which, of course, was gleefully reported by the press because, everyone just loves to hate Leon Edwards. But, this one's super weird. So, let's start from the top. Came out, Leon Edwards immediately backing Belal Muhammad up. Muhammad throwing a few front kicks, which I thought was interesting, not many low kicks. Would occasionally try and blitz forward. There was a lovely counter uppercut from Edwards at one point. He was scoring lots of body kicks, round kicks to the body, front kicks to the body, just inside and outside the elbow. Scored a really nice high kick, left high kick to the open side. Basically landed flush on the on like the jawline. Mainly like foot and bottom of shin, but it had Belal's feet go a little bit wobbly for a second. And then there were a couple of nice 1-2s and so on. But it was an uncharacteristically aggressive start, is what I'd say, from Leon Edwards. Second round starts. Leon Edwards' hand is open. He's been warned for it. He gets warned for it, I think, twice. And then Belal Muhammad comes in. I think Edwards kicked him in the body or the arm. And at the same time, his framing hand, the finger, the photo, there's an amazing photo. Like, some of these photos that you get, like, well, I mean, as a photographer, you've got to be like, wow, how on earth did I get that? But the photo shows his finger catching the eyelid and pulling it, basically, which is astonishingly bad luck. Obviously, having your fingers open going towards someone's eye is recipe for disaster anyway. But I'm saying, like, the way that it can, like, do you remember Vitor Belfort, Randy Couture, their second fight? I think it was a punch. It might have been like the edge of the glove just grazes along the short, the thinnest side of Randy Couture's eyelid. It was, you couldn't have planned it. You couldn't do it with a scalpel in surgical conditions. It was super strange, but very disconcerting because I just got through watching this a second time, and immediately I was like, I wish I hadn't watched this a second time. Firstly, for the replays, but secondly, for a grown man who is one of the baddest men on the planet in his division in the world. If you're in the top 15 in your division in the UFC, you're a pretty bad motherfucker. And he's almost immediately screaming, like he's on fire. And I'm not going to judge him for it at all. I'm just saying it's very disconcerting when that happens. Basically, you could watch him take the finger, open his eyes, not be able to see, and go into panic mode. And that's got to be really scary because, you want to be fighting for a while, but you want to be seeing things for longer than you're fighting, ideally. Which is why always maximum respect to Michael Bisping because he basically gave up his eye to fight. But yes, it has to be horrifying to be in that situation. But there was basically no chance the doctor was letting this continue. If you've already told them that you can't see, they're not going to be like, oh, give it a minute and see if you can. That just doesn't happen. Actually, on the subject of that, Marvelous Marvin Hagler died this week, and I was reminded of a very famous. Well, I mean, everyone remembers the fight with Thomas Hearns or Tommy Hearns, which was that in the third round or fourth? It was, it was a very short, action-packed affair. The war, they called it. But in the course of that, Hagler went forward, tried to beat up did beat up Tommy Hearns, and the problem was that Tommy Hearns was a massive counterpuncher. I think that was a Hajime no Ippo thing they mentioned, like the number of people that Hearns dropped on their faces because he'd get them coming in. But yeah, Hearns would break your head open if you came forward. And Hagler stuck to his chest and beat him up for 2 and a bit rounds, but had a big cut opened in his eye. And the referee, I think it's Richard Steele, who should call himself Dick Steele, he pulls Hagler over and has the doctor come in, and he says, "Can you see?" And Marvin Hagler, who's keen to get back to work, because he's got this man tired and circling the drain, he goes, "Am I missing?" It's just amazing quip in the heat of the moment. Or it might have been, "I'm not missing, am I?" But one or the other. But it was just absolutely brilliant. And they had those Burger King ads that came out. I think they showed them during the fight, and it was Marvin Hagler eating a Whopper or whatever, and going, "I wonder what the other guy's having. Probably soup." It's just a golden age for advertising with boxers, the 1980s. But yes, finger in the eye, fucking horrible. Leon Edwards had been warned, and so we get into what is a no contest and what is a no decision. What is a no contest? And, well, don't even know the difference between those, if I'm honest. But what is a no contest and what's a disqualification? I think really you've got to be arguing Leon should have been DQ'd. You can't be arguing that Peter Yan should have had the no contest, because he tried to knock the guy out with an illegal strike. Like that's as intentional as it gets. And I think you could have DQ'd Leon for this. I think the problem with eye pokes is that there is this feeling that you have to have lost the point first before there can be a DQ. And of course, it's brought into focus all the talk of the gloves again. Happens every probably half a year or so. I think we've covered this like 3 times on this podcast, and we've been doing this for a few years. But in boxing and kickboxing, people will frame with their hands. They'll put their hands out there. Boxing, typically you get told off for palming in boxing, but guys still do put their hand out there just as a measure of distance or a check. And people bring it over to MMA. With open gloves, you use your open hand, but it's super unnatural to keep your hand open and like pointed straight up at the ceiling, right angles at the wrist. So guys end up with their fingers splayed forwards, and that results in people getting poked in the eyes all the time. Now, there are some very obvious examples of people doing it on purpose. John Jones has done it through his entire career. How can I ascribe his intentions to him? Well, there are times when he just puts his hand on the person's head as they're covering up and moving forward, and then slides it down so that his fingers are in their eyes. That happened to Glover Teixeira about 3 times. But there are, I'll give most people the benefit of the doubt because it's a natural reaction to have the arm out, use the long guard, frame off the opponent, and so on. It's kind of like the grab the fence rule. If you rest your hand on the fence, unless you're working as hard as you can to like straighten your fingers out, your fingers are going to go through the fence because it's a chain link fence, or it's a link fence, and if you put your hand on it and you put any pressure on it, your fingers are going to go in without you trying to grab it. However, you can teach guys to frame with the palm and do like the leopard fist thing. Leopard fist, tiger fist. You hear it called a lot of things. A phoenix eye is what I've heard Danaher's crew call it. But when if you're trying to slide your hand in under someone's collar in the gi, you don't have your fingers extended. You bring your fingers in, but partly just so you don't scratch their fucking chin as you slide your fingers under, but also just to make that nice wedge. So like make a fist, and then release it just a little bit so that your fingers are still curled, but your middle knuckle on each finger comes forward a bit. And that's your leopard fist. And if you then point your hand upright, so your fingers are curled into your palm, but you've still got an open palm you can use. Not hard to teach guys to do that. But the gloves has always been an issue. Like 2009, Dana White said, "We're working on the gloves. We've got something in the works." Trevor Whitman went on Rogan and showed his gloves, and they all agreed, yeah, these gloves work really well. They exist because Trevor Whitman's gloves, honestly, almost identical to a pair of Shuto, or they were basically off-brand Shuto ones that I owned from years ago. In fact, I've owned a lot of different pairs of various MMA gloves and bag gloves and things like that, and a lot of them do offer that cover. That cups your fist or cups your fingers towards a fist. So and that's not just like to force your hand into a fist, but it does make it harder to project your fingers without effort, without physically trying to splay your hand and put your fingers out there. And I think that's the main thing. Like, it's like when Henna Gracie's talking about, after the George Floyd thing and the riots and stuff, Henna Gracie was like, "Let me teach BJJ to police officers." And yes, it was sort of a way to get the Gracie Academy some more cash, I imagine. But you're like, yeah, if that removes all doubt, definitely do that, but it won't. Like it's like the body cam thing. It's supposed to remove all doubt, but it doesn't. In at least legal proceedings and stuff. If you have these gloves, it should remove all doubt because the person is trying to open their hand. You therefore don't have to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. But even then, that won't work on its own. Like if you just change the gloves, and people will start getting poked in the eyes again, obviously, and people will be like, "Well, that was worth changing the gloves for." You need refs to fucking do something about it. But again, it's tricky because if you do start taking points, like there doesn't seem to be a middle ground because I am very much on the side of fucking do something about all the fingers going in the eyes, threaten to take points. But then when I see someone reply, first finger in the eye should be a point taken, I'm like, steady on, benefit of the doubt. It is, you don't want to get into this situation where people are trying to game the system because a point is a big thing in a martial art or a sport where 1 point is the difference between every round anyway. Like it's like when you see people say like, "Oh, you can take half a point," and you're like, "Well, it's exactly the same in practice as taking a full point." Or when people say, "Oh, we should have a 20-point master system to allow for more, variance in the rounds," and you go, "Well, they're only using one of the points per round anyway." It's dead tricky because you would need refs to be stricter on it, and you would need them to use video reffing almost every time that there was a glove. Well, every time that there was a finger in the eye, because people could just pretend otherwise. Never forget, who was it against Ed Herman, where Ed Herman got kneed in the... I'll tell you who was reffing, Chris Toyoni, that's who, that big slow fucker. But yeah, got kneed in the body, went down, and the ref was like, groin shot, and Ed Herman was like, yes, it was. But aside from gaming the system, like, basically the UFC said they want Whitman's gloves, or at least according to Whitman, and I don't believe Whitman would lie about this. He seems like a fairly straightforward guy, and he just said that they wanted the patent for it, rather than to just pay him to use the patent. And that's the difference. They wanted to own it, basically so that they could sell it to like LFA or wherever, or sell gloves to LFA, which is daft. Like, if you want the sport to get better, get some fucking standard gloves. It's very, very short-sighted. And you could say, like, well, it's short-sighted of Whitman. He should give them his patent, but shut up. No, he shouldn't. It's a fucking mess. And, the reason we talked about that so much is because there just wasn't a lot to get. Like, I feel like we don't have a lot learned from this fight. It's really fucking annoying. We had the fight. There was a decision. We know nothing more about the fight. And so I've seen people say, like, scrap it, move on, which is fair enough. Like, if you've got Kamaru versus Jorge Masvidal lined up and they're going to do the Ultimate Fighter over the summer or whatever, I'd say fine, fuck it. Let's do Leon Edwards and Wonderboy against each other for the person people least want to fight and move on. But I can't agree with people who are saying, like, I saw a lot of, well, Belal was getting tuned up, so we basically know how that was going. And that was never, for me, the intrigue of that fight. Like I said last week, Belal Muhammad gets a lot of takedowns, but he attempts and fails a lot of takedowns too. And the interest here was that Belal Muhammad had never been 5 rounds. Leon Edwards had been 5 rounds, but in his last 3 fights, including a three-rounder, he slowed down in the last half of all of them, despite being a guy who always goes to decision, and despite dominating those fights. And of course, he hasn't really fought a very good takedown artist or a very consistent takedown artist since, like, Kamaru Usman. So there was the intrigue. I wanted to see Leon Edwards dealing with takedowns through the rounds and working like that. And that would have given me something to learn from that fight. The other way that it could have worked out was that he could have knocked him out. And he was doing great work. Maybe he could have stepped it up and knocked him out, got some fucking hype behind him at last. But it worked out in either of those ways. It worked out in the worst way possible. And so I actually wouldn't at all be mad about a rematch. It's just that it sort of holds things up. I did hear, though, that Belal Muhammad had no lasting damage as far as they can tell, which is fantastic news, because, that would be fucking horrible. Like, the Bisping thing, so many fighters suffer significant damage to their eyes anyway in boxing and so on, just by getting all the punches to the eyes. The added horror of a finger in the eye is very scary stuff. Man, I got almost 15 minutes out of that. There you go. Talk about podcasting chicken salad from chicken shit. The rest of this card was not amazing. Oh, sorry, we'll talk about Dan Ige, because he was someone I was having a good laugh about, how he often brings, like, the worst game plan possible. And I put up, I quickly re-uploaded the Gavin Tucker Filthy Casuals guide. Took him a few years the curse, but no, Gavin Tucker, when I made that, he won the fight that he was doing. And then I re-uploaded it and he lost. So the curse is just all over the place now. There's no set rule. But yeah, Tucker came out, and I watched this a few times. But after I watched it the first time, I was like, well, get caught going on in the first time. It can happen. It's rare because it takes the guy committing to his first legitimate attack, and it takes the opponent really committing to a good counter. But no, Tucker feinted him out first, showed him a few fakes, went different ways. Ige just got his timing down. And it surprised Ige because he kept punching as Tucker was falling, he kept punching as if he was expecting to start an exchange that way. Big class from Dan Ige to not jump on the guy as he fell and his eyes were clearly glazed over. But yeah, just beautiful timing. It was Tucker trying to slide down the side of his lead foot and throw out the left straight. Ige just caught him with a short right hand coming in. Really lovely stuff. I mean, we did say last week he is good at moving his head and he does have good slips and counters. It's just that he often chooses very strange strategies for the fight as a whole. Now, interestingly, I complained about not really learning anything from the main event. Well, we learned about a round of action from the main event, but this one we learned even less. But Dan Ige gets a wicked knockout on his record. And this is what we're always saying. If you're fighting someone good, better to just spark them in 30 seconds, because then they've got to work to get a rematch at any point. What else was on this? Ryan Spann beat Misha Serkinov in a fight that I barely paid attention to. Davey Grant was a weird one. He was doing all this stance switching and stuff. I remembered his last one where he knocked that guy out with a great left hook. But he looked super confident in this one, showing lots of stance switches, showing rear leg feints into wheel kicks and stuff. It was very cool. It's just that he was consistently getting outlanded. They kept bringing up the striking stats, and he'd be 4 or 5 down on his opponent, even though he was going at it with such confidence and charisma. But he'd been trying switch hooks and switch uppercuts and things all fight. And then finally, he, as an orthodox fighter, was going down the outside of Martinez's leg, as Martinez was southpaw, as if to line up the right straight. And then he reversed direction on himself, switched stance, and came in with I think it was a right hook to the body and a left overhand. It was a very messy combination, and it was the sort of combination where, we always talk about switching stances as you step off to the side of someone, and he stepped off to the side of someone and switched stances as he was coming back through their punching range, which is not ideal, but it was the first one that caught Martinez dead to rights out of all his fancy switches and clever setups in that fight, and he sparked him. It was great. There's a place for strangeness in this sport, and I think Davey Grant is doing a good job of occupying it. Hani Yahya submitted a dude, 18 years after he turned up at ADCC? What a legend. Just one of the old boys, still getting it done. Love him. Didn't really get many of the Yahya looks that I really like. The outside, the head outside single, high crotch, the crackdown, deep half guard. It was really quite a straightforward, I think it was a trip from the clinch. And then just a lot of the underhook and head pin, trying to pass through the half guard, and eventually pressured him until he gave up the elbow and moved into an arm triangle choke. Really, the guy just looked like he had nothing for Yahya on the ground, from the bottom. He looked like he was scared to move, because he could have been shrimping, trying to pummel a butterfly hook. I think everyone should be trying to use butterfly half guard instead of getting locked down in half guard or trying to use a knee shield in MMA now. But he could have used the lockdown, he could have used the butterfly half. Instead, he was just sort of holding on to half guard. He looked very concerned that anything he gave up, Yahya was going to take more. Obviously, very easy to say because I'm not underneath Hani Yahya, but if you're on the bottom, you've got to be making something happen, because otherwise you're just waiting for Hani Yahya to pass your guard and choke you. Thinking KJ Noon's Nick Diaz won. At some point, just turn your back and get up, because there's a good chance he'll miss your back. There's no chance he'll miss if you just sit there, waiting and holding onto his leg while he grinds his way through your guard. Rest of this card, largely garbage. Charles Jourdain versus Marcelo Rojo was actually really good. A bit disappointed that they gave Jourdain a performance of the night bonus, and they gave out no fight of the night bonus on this one. How hard would it be to just give them the fight of the night bonus? Because they clearly were the fight of the night. Rojo really quite impressed me in the first round and a half. Took it to Jordan, didn't really let him kick very well, and when he did kick, he came back and he swarmed on him with body shots. Did great work. Did try the Petayan Osotogari, which they actually shouted out on the broadcast. I watched bits of this with sound. Michael Bisping was keeping DC in check. I saw someone say, let's get Bas Rutten and DC in the booth together. Wouldn't that be great? And I'm just like, no, that would be the opposite of great. That would be two guys who want to tell stories. You have one guy who wants to tell stories and a guy to keep him on track. But Rojo's approximation of that Osotogari was about as good as mine when I tried it. He went, like, he changed stances very deliberately, and then he looked like he was like getting ready. He was just working himself into it, and then he went for it, and Jordan pulled his leg back and hit him with about 3 uppercuts in the face with the collar tie. Just like, don't you fucking do that. And yeah, that was the end of that. But yeah, terrific fight I thought these two had. And I'm excited to see more of Rojo, because if you can hang with Jourdain rather, you're good enough to hang in the sort of like lower part of this, mid to lower part of this division in the UFC. Nasrat Haqparast versus Rafa Garcia. Again, Garcia impressed me. He was the guy coming in from outside. I think he was the Combate champion or something like that, but he looked decent and really just sort of like fell off through round 2 and 3. Nasrat Haqparast, I put up a tweet of this, go check my Twitter, but there's an account that Gentleman Jim Corbett gave of his famous fight with John L. Sullivan. And John L. Sullivan was fistic god. He was the manliest man in America. He was like 8 years undefeated. He knocked everyone out in an era where knockouts weren't that common, or people ground people down, but they didn't one-punch knockout them. He bridged the gap between bare knuckle and gloves. And basically, he decided the way that boxing was going to go, because as the world champion in bare knuckle and the gloves, he was like, I'm only going to defend my title in gloves from now on, because they stop me from breaking my hands and allow me to hit people harder. So he was God for Americans and people who were into boxing. And Jim Corbett came along and danced around him. And while they're in the gloves and not under like full bare knuckle rules, he did get a huge amount of rounds of just John L. swinging at him and finally put him down by merit of tiring him out. Jim Corbett's account of that fight, he says, I could tell when John L. Sullivan was going to throw his right hand, because he threw himself so far forward onto his lead leg, and he would use his lead hand not like to jab, but to slap his own inner thigh, like to take the weight of the punch that he was throwing. And there's no footage of this. There's no footage of John L. knocking people out. But I mean, boxing as an art existed. People knew about straight hitting and stuff, so it must have been quite a weird thing to catch people with so frequently. But I thought that had to be comedic exaggeration. And then I watched this Nasrat fight, and he's a southpaw, but every time he throws his left hand, his right hand comes down and hits his leg. It's absolutely incredible. And you can watch this guy, Rafa Garcia, lands almost exactly the same counter that Drew Dober knocked him out with. Because he just leans his head forward, drops his lead hand, swings the punch, and then he doesn't get back on position after he throws it. It's remarkable. I love Nasrat. I think he's a beast, but I have never really noticed how shoddy his hands are defensively when he's going forward. JJ Aldrich, the Aldrich Terror, she split decision Courtney Casey, decent. Main thing I took away from that was that my girl Aldrich finally used her giant forehead. Beautiful cheeky nodder in the first round. Had Casey come out of the clinch like checking for a cut. My girl Alabaster Holyfield. She's really fucking tasty. Jin Frey finally won a fight outright by laying on Gloria De Paula. Insane. Jin Frey, she's got like 3 degrees. As in, higher education degrees. She's stunning. She's got the biggest biceps you will see on anyone in WMMA. She's got insane abs. She's Asian, so one would love her. She should be so easy to sell, but her fights are consistently underwhelming. Though in this one, at least, she has been training at Fortis, because I think her head coach was just her husband. And, her last one against Loma Lookboonmee, where they were like, oh, maybe try a takedown in the 3rd round, just insane. Angie Hill won, which was good, and then Eric Anders versus Darren Stewart. Darren Stewart got off his hands well early. Eric Anders started pouring it on and coming back, landed an illegal knee, and it was a no contest, which is very strange because it was an obviously illegal knee, and he did illegally knee him. So that is another one where people were like, why is that a no contest? And the other one, a DQ. Fuck knows. Oh, and Manel Cape was back against Matthias Nicolau. That was very strange. Manel Cape looked good in the second and third round. Didn't do anything in the first round and lost a split decision, which he probably should have won. But for fuck's sake, man, it's like I said about Jinyu Frey in the preview episode. I'm saying it about Manel Cape now. You are a flyweight. You are never going to headline a card unless you're fighting for a title or they want to put Joe Benavidez in against you for some reason to headline a card. But otherwise, you're never going to headline a card. So you've got to fucking get to work in round 1. You can't just be like fighting scared you're going to gas yourself out by round 3 all the time. However, I did think he deserved to win that one. But now he's 0-2 in the UFC, so fucking just start hitting people in the first round. You hit harder than everyone else at that weight class. Just go for it. And that's about all I care about from that card. Oh no, the opener, Witt versus Semmelsberger. Calf kick from too close in, ate her right straight on the chin. Some people were like, that's how you counter the calf kick. No, that's how you counter someone standing too close and kicking. That's always been the counter for the low kick. Like the whole thing, the calf kicking is a problem because guys have started kicking people once they're already extending into their stance. It's not so much a problem just like if you stand there or stand on top of someone and throw a kick, you're still going to get hit in the face. So ultimately, that event was a disaster because I was like, probably one for the hardcores. There's some stuff here if you like your fights, blah, blah, blah. And then they just turned out to be rubbish anyway. So this weekend's card's a little bit weird, but we'll get into that on Wednesday. Wednesday worked well, by the way, so I'm going to keep Wednesday as the preview day. Let's answer some questions because it's been a while. Dear Jack, can you please make a Filthy Casuals guide to John Jones so he will fucking lose already? From Colin. I have been meaning to, actually, but yes. The Filthy Casuals curse, not a great weekend for it. What's up, Jack? I'm a big fan of the podcast. Thanks for dropping the good content all the time. My question is, what do you think of the K guard in MMA? Especially when he's in your guard on the fence with heavy hips. Peace from Maurice. There was a little snippet of this from Davi Ramos against Islam Makhachev. There was another snippet, there was a good amount of it from Rafael Lovato versus regional legend Gegard Mousasi. I believe he took Gegard Mousasi's regional title in that one because he wasn't old enough or welterweight enough to lose. And sorry, Gegard. Gegard, for the uninitiated, is if you're in my guard, if I'm in your guard, you reach underneath yourself with your arm and anchor to the inside of my thigh with either a scoop grip or you can go like up to the wrist if you want. Go up to the wrist. I love it. And then you use that to pull yourself around and open your hips up and slide your top knee in front of the opponent. And you can start inverting on the leg. Famous examples are, Neil Melanson made it famous by teaching it. And he saw Caro Parisian do it and named it the K-Guard because of Caro. Caro Parisian used it against George St. Pierre briefly in a fight where he got beat up on the bottom. But then in the moments he was using that, he was actually pretty safe. It's not magic, obviously, but it does keep a guy... It forces their chest up and away from you, which also gives you some separation so they can't punch you as easily, and certainly can't drop elbows on you with any weight. But Lachlan Giles really brought it to the main stage in grappling by using it in ADCC, the last one, 2019. He went out of his division in the first round against Lucas Lepre because Lucas Lepre's great. Was it Lucas? I think it was Lucas Lepre. But then he was like, fuck it. So he entered the Absolute, which typically the winner of the heavyweight division wins the Absolute. He goes through 3 heavyweights, including Kenan Duarte, the guy who just won the 99 kilos division or over 99 kilos division, by using this K-guard to invert, get on legs and heel hook them with that heel hook from the backside, like Ryan Hall did to BJ Penn. It's on YouTube. Go and watch it. Flow Grappling, I think, has it up their channel. But the K-guard, like, if the guy stays on his knees and you can't get in on the leg, you can threaten the leg and snap back on the triangle. You can invert and just keep them off you. Like the Lovato Mousasi fight, we were talking seriously about it, which I'm loath to do about Mousasi. But Lovato had gassed out. Mousasi ended up on top of him. He was getting hit, so he anchored to the leg, put his knees in front and went upside down, and then he poked his head out so that he was basically face down, arse up with his shin on Mousasi's chest, and Mousasi couldn't really hit him because he was having to go basically over his arse. So not a bad waiting it out sort of position either. I think there's an incredible amount of... I was talking about the K-guard a while ago when we were talking about Habib, because I always thought it was an interesting way to play against that really pressure-heavy top game. That and the Giggler sweep, because you saw Mansour Barnoui use the Giggler against Habib's cousin and Islam Makhachev. And you saw a little bit of K-guard from Davi Ramos against Islam Makhachev in the last round of their fight. But their fight was mainly a kickboxing match where Davi Ramos just swung punches wildly and lost. I think ultimately the guard is a bad place to be in MMA, and that's not changing. I think the K-guard is a good one because leg entanglements do make the top game much more difficult, and they are one of the most reliable ways to sweep, or at least stop the guy working effectively on top. And it's a way of using the knee shield in a way that, the half guard knee shield, you see a lot of guys just pressure through that now. Like Stephen Thompson tried to knee shield against Tyron Woodley in their first fight. Tyron Woodley just put his hips on top of it and started punching him in the face. It's very hard to maintain that sort of low knee shield. Or, it's very hard to maintain a high knee shield, and the low knee shield doesn't really protect you from punches. Think of like the Craig Jones low knee shield, like in the hip, which is amazing for getting in on the legs, but definitely not the same sort of protection from punches that a high knee shield is. So K-guard, good, I would say. I'm excited to see more guys use it. I think one of the reasons we haven't seen so much of it is the main innovator of it until recently was Neil Melanson, and he mainly works with guys who are high-level wrestlers, guys like Michael Chandler and Randy Couture back in the day, guys who are just not going to be playing the bottom game, if at all possible. Oh, and you said specifically if he's in your guard on the fence with heavy hips. Less keen on that because I think you're going to have a harder time inverting on his legs, and that's a lot of what makes the threat. When I see guys get stacked against the fence, I think just abandon full guard altogether. Let the guy pass over one of your legs, come into half guard, try and dig an underhook. Absolute worst case scenario, get in half guard without the underhook, try and dig the underhook on the other side, or use a butterfly hook and then try and switch sides. Anything is better than just getting that. Like Yair Rodriguez, getting stuck underneath Frankie Edgar, pressed up against the fence and just getting hit. Anything is better than that. There was a guy who did it against Volkanovski. Volkanovski was just taking him down at will on the fence. And the moment that he let Volkanovski pass to half guard, he actually had some success coming up on the single and getting out. It was the trying to hold full guard and wall walk up from there that just wasn't working. Hey Jack, I'm relatively new to MMA and have loved learning more about the sport by watching your tactical guides, as well as listening to your podcast rigorously. Oh no, religiously. Either's good. UFC 259 has me thinking of fighters who rely heavily on stance switching such as Adesanya, Sterling and even Petr Yan. It seems like a very effective tool for confusing an opponent in MMA, and I'm wondering why it's seldom used in the world of boxing. My untrained mind would imagine that with fewer weapons to use, namely two fists, stance switching could be a valuable asset to a boxer. From Paul. We briefly touched on this last week, but it does bring us around nicely to Marvin Hagler, who died this week, as I mentioned earlier. But he was probably, there's probably been a few before him, but he was the first really notable switch hitter in boxing. And he used to identify as a southpaw, but he used to say he was a southpaw. Because if you watch any interviews with him, he said one of the reasons that he had a hard time getting high-ranking opponents, even when he was doing well, was that because he was a southpaw. Except that wasn't entirely true. It was that he was a weird southpaw who switched hit a lot. Hagler fought a lot southpaw out in the open, and then when he moved in close against orthodox opponents, he would switch to orthodox so that he could come in to that symmetrical position. We talked about this on the Gavin Tucker Filthy Casuals Guide, which you can check out on the YouTube channel right now. But when you're left foot versus orthodox versus orthodox, or southpaw versus southpaw, when you come together, the stances just slide together. You can go in close range, you can come out, you can slide in and out of range easily. When you're southpaw versus orthodox, or orthodox versus southpaw, when you move to close range, your lead knees get in the way of each other. So one foot has to go outside and one foot has to come inside. You can do work from both. I'm not saying outside foot position is the key to everything, but it does mean that the position is not symmetrical. It gets, and particularly guys in boxing are always bouncing off each other. If you watch his fight with Duran, Marvin Hagler, they're fucking bumping lead legs all the time. But it was always a taboo in boxing, and there's a good reason for that. If you are in the process of switching stances, you are very at risk of getting hurt. Think of TJ Dillashaw versus John Dodson, but there's a few examples in boxing. There was a Mickey Ward fight a while ago. Well, no, I mean obviously a while ago, but fuck, I can't remember who it was. But basically, every time he switched stances, he did it right in front of the guy, and the guy would pop him with the right straight as soon as he was switching stances. There was a really good one. Jacobs, is it Danny Jacobs versus Golovkin, where he was doing great work from both stances, but Golovkin would like let him. Basically, Golovkin got behind and started letting Jacobs work his jab from orthodox, and he waited for the moment that he switched to southpaw, and like Jacobs would switch to southpaw and start assessing his openings from there. But at the moment he switched, Golovkin steps deep and throws a long right hand, because it wouldn't have been there as an orthodox fighter. It would have been like a naked right lead, which is not what you do against orthodox fighters. But in the second that he's switching his stances, Golovkin steps through and it's like throwing downfield to where the receiver is going to be, not where they are. He goes, okay, you're going to be in southpaw just there. Bam, catches him, knocks him down. I mean, that's a really good fight. Danny Jacobs looked phenomenal in that fight, but that little piece of catching him from Golovkin, just an absolute animal. But yeah, in the process of switching stances, you kind of, firstly, in the process of switching stances where your feet come together, you're at risk of being knocked down by even partial punches. Like TJ Dillashaw got clipped by John Dodson, never got his footing again because he's just off balance the entire time. John Dodson also did it against Demetrius Johnson. Demetrius Johnson got knocked down, I think, twice in that fight while his feet were coming together, while he was shifting. But more than that, you aren't going to perfect your whole game from two stances because you're doing twice as much work. And, it's not even that. You can't do twice as much work. Boxers are pretty, there's a certain amount you can do in a day before you start doing damage in terms of recovery. You can't do double the amount of work than everyone else and get both stances done. So you're going to be working less with both stances. Which, if you're an absolute freak, that's one thing, but you're never going to have as much practice from both stances as your opponent does from just the one. So you tend to learn to use it just for bits and pieces. Bud Crawford, very comfortable fighting from both stances, but he does certain things from one stance and certain things from another. Or the other. There's only two, but in MMA, that's the fairly obvious ones, like Pat Barry would only ever throw the left high kick from his southpaw stance or a leaping right hook. Those are the only two things he did, but you had to be aware of it. So in that way, you've learned two stances to offer more offensive options and be more unpredictable or less predictable. But by having certain things you do from one stance and certain things you do from another, the stance itself can become a telegraph. And with obviously only the hands in boxing, that's a little bit more, you don't want to be offering telegraphs. I think that's one of the interesting things about Bud Crawford. He tends to pick a stance and stick with it for most of a fight. So it's more like he's studied his opponent and he said, this is what's going to work best for me against them, and they have to deal with what he's presented them just for that fight. But in terms of like I said, you can't be perfect. You can't have an all-round game from both stances. Marvin Hagler was... he's a very well-rounded fighter, considered, great on the inside, great on the outside, great conditioning, great power, could box, could fight, could just really slug it out, could foul with the best of them. But a number of the guys he fought, like I think Leonard said it, and maybe Duran, but they noted that his right hand from both stances was so much stiffer than his left. Like even when he fought southpaw and had all that space to throw long left straights, it was still not as stiff as like his right jab. And I think that's the thing, if you're a right-handed fighter and you switch to southpaw and then you try and fight like someone who's a left-handed southpaw, like the traditional way of fighting southpaw, you might end up selling yourself short. But it is becoming much more normal now. You've got Bud Crawford, you've got Andre Ward was switching stances quite a lot. Golovkin obviously shifts a lot. A shift is more a temporary switch of stance, and then you're basically setting up like a little set piece, and then you get back on your normal stance. But you are seeing it a little bit more, and it's also not as frowned upon or thought of as weird, especially with people like Bud Crawford being so highly regarded pound for pound. It's not that weird anymore because people will look at Bud Crawford and go, hey, maybe I should try some of that. But for examples of guys who switch hit, like Brendan Ingle's gym, they were very big on that. He died last year or maybe this year, Brendan Ingle. But he taught Naseem Hamed, Prince Naseem. But Bomber Graham trained out of there. Junior Witter, he never got to like the highest levels, but he was very intriguing. He could do some weird stuff from both stances. Can't remember all of them from there now, but there were a few, and they were good fun. I think Kid Galahad from there. Can't remember, but yeah, a gym that's worth looking into if you want to see guys switch hitting with decent success in boxing. And the one fight specifically is when Naz fought Steve Robinson for the title, where he fights from, as Brendan Ingle said, 5 stances. So left and right stance, both bladed and more square on, and then feet level, literally square. And he does all of them, and it's a masterclass. Cheers, Bolt. Howdy, Slacky J, the Scrivener Sensei. In Trevor Whitman's footwork blueprint on dynamic striking, he talks about double jabbing with first a rear leg step, narrowing the stance, allowing a further, faster spearing jab on the second. Do you think this is a helpful concept in narrowing the window for the calf kick, or since you still end up in a widening stance, does it leave your leg on a platter? What about if the rear leg step also cuts an angle? Would that make you easier or harder to calf kick? I feel like I don't have a good grip on calf kick timing or the angle of getting the calf rather than the shin, and we don't train them at my gym, so thanks for any insight on that generally. For reference, if you'd like, the sequence I'm talking about is for the beginning of volume 3, and a question on history. I also picked up Neil Melanson's catch wrestling formula, was wondering, is he connected to the English catch wrestling scene you often mention, so many of the original JMMA guys learned from? The Patriots instructional talked a lot about Hayastan and his creds there, and I was wondering about the connection between those two grappling worlds. From Alex, wow, this is just like a little ad from my friends at BJJ Fanatics. Firstly, Whitman and Gaethje's instructional on dynamic striking, BJJ Fanatics, wherever you get it, really good. I mean, I've been doing this thing. I was saying I'm going to write down all the instructionals that really have impressed me this year, because I'm watching all these instructionals. There's not much point in me talking about ones that I wasn't that impressed with or I'd seen the stuff before, but there is a lot of point in me talking about the ones that did impress me. And there's a lot of things like just being surprised by how good a teacher someone is, or how unique their ideas are. And that's always been the case with Neil Melanson. I've always been amazed by some of the ideas he brings. And it was the case where, like, you'd go on forums and they'd be like, who the hell is this Neil Melanson? Has he even done anything? Blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly, K-Guard, he brought that in. Suddenly, Lachlan Giles is murdering heavyweights with it. But Whitman's footprint blueprint is excellent. It's full of little tricks to get you interesting angles and so on. Like he's, for people who drop away for that open side counter, if you're against a southpaw like Conor McGregor, obviously not him because you're not someone who has to fight Conor McGregor, but he drops away back to his left and then he throws the left hand over the top. And you'll see so many guys doing this now, like Tenshin Nasukawa, others, I'm sure. There are lots, but I just can't be asked to think of them right now. But it's a very common counter in modern MMA. And he's big on throwing the right hand out, but not really caring about it, while you move your back foot up to your lead foot and then angling around with a 1-2. And I really do. It's something that I learned a lot about in traditional karate. Like if you train with really good point fighters, they're very keen on back foot placement. And it's interesting. Jimmy Wild, in one of his little books, talked about back foot placement being the most important thing in both defense and offense. But typically boxing is about momentary extensions of the stance and then recovering the stance. So, like throw a 1-2, both feet move. Or you throw a jab, both feet move. But you're going outside foot, inside foot, I think is the basketball terminology. Whatever direction you're moving in, the nearest foot moves first, and then the other foot comes up to re-establish the stance length that you started with. Point fighting footwork is a lot more, well, it's heavily influenced by kendo, which obviously is a form of fencing, but it is very similar to fencing, Western fencing as well, which is you sneak your back foot up so that you can lunge as far as possible to score that point. When I wrote Fighting Karate, which I will update and put on the Patreon at some point, there was a lot of talk of sneaking the back foot up, and I learned some really interesting ways from some very good point fighters. But they'll do all sorts of things, like they'll just circle their hands and they'll try and keep their stance the same height as they sneak their back foot in underneath them, and then lunge further than you think they can. And it sort of links in with like what we were saying about Bill Wallace the other week and other people who are very good at kicking with their lead leg. They need to bring their rear foot up first to actually make some ground with their kick. So they'll throw their jab just to hide their back foot coming up. But in terms of offense, if you're dealing with someone who is just really good at staying out of the way, when you're giving them the basics, you do need to be able to do something different. And moving your back foot first is something different. You do have the disadvantage that if they come in on you or they hit you when your back foot's underneath you, you've got the same problem as if you get caught shifting. Your feet are together. So you might get knocked down. But if you're, as long as you're not abusing it, as long as you're not making it really obvious every time, it definitely has a place in your arsenal. In fact, I would say that if you don't learn to use your back foot placement and sneak it up or just skip it up and make that extra bit of distance, you're probably selling yourself short. It's like learning to cross step. It's not something you use all the time, but it is something that's useful to have in the bag. Actually, I'd say it's more important than that, to be honest. But and then the calf kick. What was that about the calf kick? Do you think this is helpful in narrowing the window for the calf kick? If you're doing the calf kicking, I mean, it's as valuable closing the distance on the calf kick as almost anything else, because you're going to go back foot and then your lead foot's going to go out. I think the calf kick, typically, one of the reasons that it's been successful for guys like Izzy, Volkanovski, so on, is that they get in range where they can touch their opponent's hands, as Hooft said to Gilbert Burns in his fight with Woodley, touch his hands, then kick. But if you get into that sort of range, you kick and your lead foot is an anchor. It doesn't need to step forward. Whereas if you're moving your back foot first, you're probably from a further distance, so you're then going to have to move your front foot again anyway. So probably, unless you're coming in from a big distance to try and kick the calf, probably not necessary. I think the calf kick as a lead tends to work better when you're already pressuring your way into that sort of kicking range. In terms of dealing with the calf kick, I think it could actually be pretty useful, because the whole thing about the calf kick as a countermeasure is that you're counting on where the opponent is going to put their lead foot. If you start moving your back foot up first, maybe even show them that you're like standing narrower, bringing your back foot up, you're changing the distance that you can move in on your thrust when you do, but you're also threatening to pick up your lead leg and kick them or float in behind a high knee. So I think rear foot, we've gone through this stage where everyone's learning to box and learning to put their lead foot in and learning to apply the jab effectively. I think we're going to go through a phase of people learning to use their back foot for entries more successfully too. Now, we went down a rabbit hole there. And the other question on that one was Melanson's lineage. I know that he was a higher stand guy, which is Gokor Chivinshin and Judo Jean Lebel, and he was with Karo Parisian. I think he's been involved in scientific wrestling and that sort of stuff, because I know in some of his DVDs he definitely references training with Billy Robinson. Billy Robinson ended up in some weird gym out in Utah by the end of his life, so he trained some really interesting places. Catch wrestling's a weird one, because a lot of people who are into catch wrestling are sort of LARPers, but there are some guys, you could just turn up in a random gym in Lancashire and who's it, Tommy Haynes? And he'd just be teaching in a woolly jumper, but he'd be teaching the stuff that they were doing at the Snake Pit 50 years ago. It's a weird one, catch wrestling. There isn't a lot of... it's because they didn't give out belts. You were training at the Snake Pit or you weren't. So as far as Melanson's ties specifically to catch wrestling, I think he's more influenced by it, which, honestly, fine by me. He trained with Randy Couture. He was Randy Couture's grappling coach and sparring partner for a long-ass time. If he's using classical wrestling methods in a grappling context, then, he's doing basically what catch wrestling was. It was, particularly in Wigan, it was influenced by, Kushti from India, because it was part of the boom in Wigan catch wrestling. And then you should read Billy Robinson's book for this, but it was heavily influenced by Britain's colonies. Kushti from India had a big influence on the British wrestling scene. And Karl Gotch came in from Germany and trained at the Snake Pit, and he was a successful freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestler. It was the Snake Pit was amazing. It's been sort of glorified to the point of no return at this point, but the Snake Pit was basically effective for the same reason that so many of the top gyms are today, like Henzo's or something like that. It's just a melting pot with a lot of good guys, and they're bringing in new ideas and they're sparring regularly with each other, and they're just improving. It's any great gym is normally just full of good guys who are there going, let's try this, let's try that. How can I deal with so and so? He specifically is giving me trouble. Anyway, cheers, Alex. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. Probably a low listen / view kind of day with that event. But we got Kevin Holland versus Brunson at the weekend, which actually looks pretty fun, and the card's not bad, if I'm honest. If you missed it on Friday, I put out a Slacky's Film Room. Hadn't done one of those in a while, but it was multi-man MMA events, and there were honestly a couple of good ones, which I was very surprised by. The old ZST ones, astonishingly good for what they were. And good fighters too. Like it was Rich Clementi and Jeff Curran before they were in WEC were doing tag team matches in Japan. Just so bizarre. And Imanari. But yeah, if you want to listen to that or support the podcast or get all of the extra stuff we do for the patrons, join the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing at any time, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Grazed corneas bless.